Who was the first American? We thought we knew the answer. The New World was first inhabited by big game hunters from Siberia. They walked over the Bering Land Bridge at the end of the last ice age. But now, some scientists, using techniques borrowed from crime scene investigators, are questioning this conventional version of prehistory. They've uncovered a new story about who the first American really was. It may be time to rewrite the first epic chapters of the history of the Americas. Today, millions of people live in the Americas. But who is the very first person to set foot here? Can he reveal anything about who we are today? Finding the first American is like solving a huge jigsaw puzzle. The problem is, we don't have all the pieces yet. Until now, there's only one story most of us learned in school.
I think that people came over from Asia across the Bering Strait and through Alaska.
My theory is that Alaska and Russia used to touch, so that people from that part of Asia could cross over.
I guess they came through Siberia and they migrated down to the Americas.
According to the popular theory, Siberian tribespeople were hunters. They arrived in the Americas around 13,500 years ago, following herds of big game like mammoths. At that time, much of the world's water was ice, so sea levels were much lower than today. This meant that the Bering Straits were a land bridge, where Stone Age people were able to cross on foot to reach the Americas. It's a great story. The trouble is, recent evidence suggests it might not be true. To find the first American, we need to scour the evidence he left behind. A good place to start is here, in the Southwest. 50 miles from Austin, Texas is a place called Galt. 13,000 years ago, this was a camp. All that remains today are the bones and tools the hunters left behind. Close inspection of these tools allows scientists like Dr. Mike Collins to reevaluate our image of ancient Americans.
There we go.
All right, that's good.
When it came to hunting, they knew exactly what they were doing.
I mean, that thing did an enormous amount of damage.
If you notice, the shape of this thing is not greatly different than the tip of a missile. It's designed for penetration and for traveling through the air.
Early Americans carved their spear points using stone tools and antler bones. They would remove the outer cortex of the stone, then thin it and flake it to achieve a razor-sharp edge and aerodynamic point. Its laurel shape makes it break resistant, and because the point narrows towards the base, it eliminates drag as it penetrates the animal.
The flint knappers who made those tools were very skilled. It is a remarkable piece of craftsmanship.
Collins is impressed by early Americans' knowledge of ballistics. But when he looks at other ancient tools, he realizes that big game hunting is only a small part of the life of the first Americans. This is the toolkit of our prehistoric ancestors. As he examines it, he makes a discovery. Almost every tool has a modern equivalent, except this one. This stone tool has an unusual edge and is particularly shiny. The only way to examine it properly is under a microscope.
What magnification are we looking at here?
This is 200x.
200.
Analyst Marilyn Schoberg identifies polish and striations, which to her trained eye mean one thing.
These are terrific indicators of use on grass, those comet-shaped pits that are mixed in there.
Silica polish inside the cells of grass caused this shiny veneer. Collins had stumbled upon a prehistoric grass-cutting blade, a scythe. For him, it was a life-changing moment.
That's when you begin to turn the corner and realize that we're dealing with a much more sophisticated, much more complex lifeway than we had previously thought.
This discovery challenges the one-dimensional stereotype of the first American as simply a roaming big game hunter. It seems we've seriously underestimated the first Americans. Collins isn't alone in thinking this. 1,500 miles north of Texas, Professor James Adovasio also works to redefine the first Americans. His hunting ground? Ancient American graves.
Fresh bodies. Yeah. Great.
Adovasio examines the past like a crime scene investigator.
Well, archaeology is like forensic science, except the crime that we're reconstructing is not yesterday, it's 200,000 yesterdays ago.
These bodies are called the Windover skeletons, after the place in Florida where they lay for nearly 8,000 years. This is an ancient cemetery. There are 168 bodies of men, women, and children. Adovasio isn't looking at the bodies. Instead, he examines the shrouds these people were wearing. It doesn't look like much, but these small pieces of fabric might reveal the extent of early American technological know-how. But he faces a problem. This fabric is extremely fragile. It must be kept in a stable environment away from oxygen. Adovasio can look at the material for only a matter of minutes before it starts to disintegrate. So he turns to forensic technology. This is a Perilyn machine, and it is used to coat objects in a vapor-deposited protective polymer. The machine heats this powder to a temperature of 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point it becomes a vapor. On contact with an object, the vapor cools and turns into a plastic film. If this burnt newspaper were a clue at a crime scene, a Perilyn coating makes it stronger. This protective layer means that the newspaper could now last for 6,000 years. Adovasio used the Perilyn technology to coat the Windover shrouds. Under the microscope, he sees that the fabric is tightly woven and sophisticated.
They are burying their dead in fabrics, which for the time are the equivalent of an Armani suit or a Versace dress.
The amount of time and energy spent in creating such intricate material indicates to Adovasio that these people might have more in common with us than we might think. Far from being primitive hunters, the first Americans were just as intelligent as we are. They didn't have the tools we have today, but they were skilled craftsmen. They were knowledgeable pioneers, changing the world they lived in. And they were attempting something else that we see as the essence of the 21st century: communication. Most of us learned in school that the first Americans were hunters coming from Siberia. But pioneering researchers are taking this story on. They think the first American was more complex than this one-dimensional stereotype. Dr. James Adovasio uses modern forensics to gain an insight into the technological sophistication of ancient Americans. One stone doesn't look like much to the naked eye, but Adovasio uses a high-tech machine to examine it in minute detail. This machine is a polynomial texture mapping dome, a PTM. With a camera at the apex of the dome, the machine uses 50 individual strobe lights as it takes multiple digital images. Now, markings on the stone that are difficult to decipher become visible. Adovasio immediately sees familiar markings on the stone. He thinks someone engraved this pattern with a purpose.
The artist makes a conscious attempt to depict what we think is the edge of a plated basket or a plated sandal. Now, when you pick up an actual specimen from that area, you can see even the angle at which these strips are crossed is duplicated here in stone.
The similarity between the plated sandal and the stone markings is striking. Adovasio thinks that this could be a 13,000-year-old instruction manual. Early Americans were recording their knowledge of how to weave in order to share learned skills. If Adovasio is right, then this is a form of prehistoric communication. This suggests a new picture of early Americans.
These folks were not supposed to be living in settled communities. They were not supposed to be producing fabrics of any kind. They were not supposed to be doing, as it turned out, a lot of the things that we now know they are doing.
The first American could be a very different kind of person from the popular stereotype. But the intelligence of our ancient ancestors isn't the only part of this epic story that might be wrong. Scientists also challenge the date the first Americans set foot on the continent. Geoarchaeologist Dr. Sylvia Gonzalez works at Liverpool John Moores University in England. She has a personal reason for wanting to find out more about the first Americans.
I'm Mexican, and I want to know from where I'm coming from.
1 hour south of Mexico City is the Vasaquillo Basin. In 2003, Gonzalez came here to study volcanic rock. As she searched an ancient layer in a quarry, something caught her eye.
I started to walk, and I walked a meter, and then I started to see them.
She sees small depressions in the rock, which she identifies immediately as human footprints.
And I was quite in shock because I knew that this layer was in such a position that I knew that was very, very old.
Over many years, volcanic eruptions covered the area in blankets of soft ash. As people stepped onto the ash, they left footprints. Following the eruptions, the rising waters of a nearby lake carried a fine-grained sediment which covered and preserved the hardened ash layer, fossilizing the footprints. The team has found what they believe to be more than 250 human footprints. The team uses two methods to date the prints. They measure the carbon within the organic material, and they also measure the time elapsed since light exposed these minerals. When the date comes back, it suggests that the footprint layer is 40,000 years old. If these really are human footprints, then American history begins 25,000 years earlier than we learned in school. But Gonzalez must first overcome a hurdle.
But that's not going to be good because we are destroying the
Not everyone within the scientific community agrees that these depressions are footprints. To prove her theory, Gonzalez and the team turned to the latest technology in laser reproduction.
There we go.
This is how it works. The laser scans this modern footprint and creates a three-dimensional computer image.
There it is.
There it is.
Gonzalez and her team can rotate and study the footprints while technicians use the models to create plastic replicas. Now, scientists around the world can examine the evidence in 3D with their own eyes. These 40,000-year-old footprints are controversial. Some experts question whether these impressions really are human footprints, or whether quarrying machinery made the indentations. Others refuse to entertain the idea that people could have been in the Americas 40,000 years ago. And yet, Gonzalez's work is not isolated. 35 miles southwest of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, stands Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. Archaeologist James Adovasio has made a remarkable find here. And it's much more tangible than a footprint. People have come here for thousands of years to hunt, fish, and collect berries and nuts. And every generation leaves its mark. For the past 33 years, Adovasio and his team have painstakingly peeled back layer upon layer to try and work out what people were doing here at different times. The black line shows the carbon remnants of a prehistoric fire. By radiocarbon dating the organic material, Adovasio can date each layer.
Within each one of these layers are smaller units. Those are like pages within a chapter, and each one of those pages is a literal moment in time.
The first Americans were supposed to have set foot on the continent around 13,500 years ago. But when Adovasio hit the 13,500-year-old layer, he kept on digging.
As the seasons progressed and the site got deeper and progressively older, we began to realize that the kind of materials we were recovering here were pretty much unprecedented.
After a year of digging in Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, the team found a stone point that would help rewrite the history books.
This very delicate tool is the oldest form tool from the site. It's slightly older than 16,000 years.
This find suggests that there was human life in North America 16,000 years ago. Because if there was a tool, there were people. Evidence of ancient human occupation in the Americas now emerges all over both continents. In Cactus Hill, Virginia, evidence of life is dated back 17,000 years. These 16 and 17,000-year-old dates are controversial, but many archaeologists now accept that Americans were here long before 13,500 years ago. By pushing back the date, another hole in the original story starts to appear. And here's why. During the last ice age, huge ice sheets covered North America. It was possible to walk from Siberia to Alaska, but ice barred the way south. Then, around 13,500 years ago, a passageway in the ice opened up, and people could walk down into the lower states. If there were people in the Americas before this corridor existed, then all the pieces in the puzzle start to move.
If you are able to prove that humans were there in the central part of Mexico 40,000 years ago, then you need to start to ask yourself questions like, well, from where are they coming from?
The answer to this question shows that the pioneering spirit of the modern Americas was shared by our ancient ancestors. Today, there are hundreds of different cultures living side by side in the Americas. Let's take a journey to find the first American. When scientists uncovered evidence of life on this continent that went back more than 13,500 years, they knew that the story we'd grown up with could be wrong. We learned that the first Americans came on foot from Siberia around 13,500 years ago. They traveled across the Bering Land Bridge into Alaska and down an ice-free corridor into the lower states. The corridor holds the key to this puzzle. It only opened 13,500 years ago. Before that, huge ice sheets blocked access south from Alaska. If people were living in America before this time, then the corridor could not have been their point of entry. So where did these ancient Americans come from? Over the past decade, scientists have begun to think laterally about this puzzle. They've looked at how people have migrated elsewhere on the planet, like Australia. Humans reached Australia some 50,000 years ago. And at that time, there was only one way to get there.
They had to cover, at a minimum, 65 miles of open water. Maybe not even knowing that a landmass was there. What that tells us is that they had to have had boats.
No boat from 15,000 years ago has ever been found in America. But Professor Terry Jones doesn't think that means they didn't have them. He takes a different approach to discover if the first American might have been an intrepid sailor. He looks at what kinds of boats the great-grandparents of today's Native Americans made. He teams up with Native American Linda Yamane, who built this Tula balsa boat out of bulrushes. Jones wants to test if a boat like this could ever have brought people into the New World. One way to find out is to give it a try.
So how does it feel, Terry?
Takes a little bit getting used to, but it's actually kind of pleasant. I certainly could see somebody fishing with one of these, especially once they've had a little bit of experience with it, but it's hard to imagine somebody going out far into the open ocean.
To sail straight across the Pacific in a boat would not only take weeks, but it would be a treacherous journey and an extraordinary feat of balance, luck, and navigation. But there is another route, a kind of highway that lies just off the coast of California. It's a highway made of a seaweed called giant kelp, and it grows in colder seas around the world. The tops of the plants rest on the water, clearly visible from the shoreline. A kelp forest is one of the richest habitats in the world, attracting phenomenal wildlife, including fish, mammals, and birds. It's also one of the fastest growing plants on Earth. The kelp forest in the Pacific Ocean hugs the shoreline from Asia to the Americas. Professor John Erlandson is putting two and two together when he overlays the kelp forest map with a map showing human remains around the Pacific and hits the jackpot.
What was extraordinary for me was to learn that there are kelp forests extending all the way from Japan around the North Pacific down into Baja California. And a lot of these stars in the North Pacific are archaeological sites that are located adjacent to kelp forests. and some of them show that people were exploiting kelp forest habitats. They were fishing and hunting and collecting shellfish.
The rich ecosystem of the Kelp Highway was a roadmap and a procession of fast food outlets en route from Asia into the New World. Mariners could have tied their boats to the kelp fronds while they rested, and kelp would have provided shelter from bigger waves.
Well, we really live on a blue planet, not a green planet. 70% of the Earth is covered by the ocean, and that the irony that scientists thought that, you know, the ocean played very little role in human migrations and human societies until recently it just doesn't work.
It seems our ancient ancestors had the courage and skill to conquer the oceans. The first American was much more than a roaming hunter. He was a highly skilled technician, a pioneer, and he may have reached the Americas thousands of years earlier than previously thought. But where he came from is still a mystery. The traditional story says early Americans were descended from one group coming from Siberia, who walked into the Americas across the Bering Land Bridge. But if they had the technological sophistication to get here by boat, they could have come from anywhere.
When we first started talking about it, people say, well, you know, you have the Atlantic Ocean out there and the Titanic couldn't make it across. How do you expect a caveman to make it across, you know?
This man is convinced that the first Americans came from Europe. And he thinks he's got the evidence to prove it. Searching for the first American is like building a giant jigsaw puzzle with pieces missing. Some recently discovered pieces in the puzzle suggest that the first American arrived here much earlier than 13,500 years ago. He wasn't just a primitive hunter at the mercy of nature, but a highly skilled and daring pioneer. If he didn't walk across the Bering Land Bridge, he must have arrived by boat. But where he came from and what he might have looked like is still unknown. The history books say he came from Siberia, but did he? At the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., archaeologist Dr. Dennis Stanford has a new perspective on the first American. Stanford is an expert on prehistoric weapons. These stone tools made by ancient Americans have given him enormous respect for their skills and intellect.
We've got to quit thinking of them as primitive people. They just didn't have the sophisticated tools we have.
Stanford is particularly interested in how prehistoric tools evolved. Technology moves in recognizable steps. You can't invent a modern sports vehicle without an earlier model automobile. And so it is with Stone Age weapons. Stanford searched for the technological ancestor to the earliest Stone Age spear points found in the Americas. If he could find an earlier weapon in the sequence, he would have a clue as to where the first American came from. He scoured Alaska and Siberia, but found nothing. Eventually, he found a stone point almost identical to a 13,000-year-old American spear tip, but with a key difference. This is the ancestor to the American spear tip. It is a laurel leaf-shaped spear point, which has been thinned and flaked on both sides. The American point shows a technological improvement. It has a groove taken out of both sides of its base. This groove meant that a hunter could slide the point onto a spear shaft more efficiently.
It's an improvement in the technology, with the Clovis point being a Lotus Elan, having developed out of the invention of the Model T.
The point Stanford calls the Model T was made by a people known as the Solutreans. They lived around 18,000 years ago. They didn't live in America, and they didn't live in Siberia. They lived in Western Europe. But how could they have made a journey of more than 2,000 miles to America? Stanford thinks the geography of the Ice Age holds the key. 18,000 years ago, there was a bridge of polar ice that connected Western Europe with southeastern Canada. The nutrient-rich water at the edge of this bridge attracted phenomenal wildlife.
Western Europe is connected to North America by an ice bridge that makes an arc of ice all the way across there. And the hunters and the seals are all moving along the edge of the ice. And so you're just following this land bridge, basically, except it's made out of ice instead of land.
If Stanford's right, some early Americans came from Europe.
The sea is a barrier if you're on foot and you don't have a boat. But if you have a boat, it becomes a highway, a very fast, rapid way to move across the face of the globe.
This breakthrough idea that the first Americans were courageous pioneers who used boats to reach America reorders the entire jigsaw puzzle. It throws open the possibility that the first American could have come from almost any country that shared an ocean with America, as far away as Japan in the west and Europe in the east. That's the theory. But can we prove it? Genetic testing is used to solve crimes, and scientists hope it might solve this mystery. Geneticists have extracted DNA from ancient skeletons, but they also take another approach. They are examining the DNA of today's Native Americans to track their genetic ancestry. They look at the DNA of the mitochondria, which are the energy workhorses within our cells. Mitochondrial DNA is only passed down the maternal line from mother to child. And as this happens, mutations take place.
I'm the king of the world. I'm the king of the world.
It works just like a game of telephone. After changes along the line, the sentence at the end is slightly different.
I'm giggling with the world. I'm giggling for the world. I'm giggling for the world. I'm the king of the world.
The same thing happens as mitochondrial DNA is passed down generations. Geneticists count the differences between two people's mitochondrial DNA. This way, they can work out how long ago their common maternal ancestor lived. DNA testing of modern Native Americans indicates that they share a common ancestor, not with Europeans, but with modern Siberians. This common ancestor lived between 14 and 20,000 years ago. Genetic evidence tells one story, but ancient American bones suggest a totally different version of events. Some skeletal research indicates that the first American didn't come from Siberia after all. 2006. An ancient American body raises hopes within the scientific community on the hunt for the first American. World-leading forensic anthropologist Dr. Doug Owsley has worked to identify the victims of Waco in 1993 and of 9/11 in 2001. He tries to solve the mystery of where the first American came from by examining ancient skeletons.
There's nothing out there that you could find that could tell you more about a past way of life, of past people, than the bones themselves. If you know how to read those bones, if you know how to listen to them, they will speak volumes.
There are very few ancient skeletons, ones more than 10,000 years old, in North America. So every single one is precious to the scientific detectives on the trail of the first American. scientists examine ancient bones to work out what people looked like. This may help solve the puzzle of where the first American came from. These are the bodies of a man and a child. They are 11,000 years old and known simply as Horn Shelter Number 2, from the place near Waco, Texas, where archaeologists found them. Finding a skeleton of this antiquity is like stumbling upon an enormous treasure. Around the child's neck was a very fine needle, needed for sewing clothes in the afterlife. With the man was a toolkit, including an antler bone to make new tools if need be. 5 turtle shells lay in the grave. One acted as the man's pillow, another covered his face. The talon of a hawk rests in his mouth. The Horn Shelter skeletons indicate to the experts that people living in America 11,000 years ago were far from primitive. They cared for their dead and believed in an afterlife. But if scientists can also discover what ancient settlers looked like, then they may have another clue to where the first American came from. Amanda Danning works with Doug Owsley to recreate the facial structure of the Horn Shelter skeleton. As the flesh appears on his bones, we begin to get an idea of what he looks like. It's as if he suddenly comes to life.
You can't help but wonder if he ever walked out on the vista just in front of the shelter where he was found and looked out and saw the bluebonnets and said, "Wow, that's really beautiful." Or if he said, "I bet there's snakes in there."
When Danning completes the face of the Horn Shelter skeleton, Owsley is intrigued because the skeleton looks neither Siberian nor European. Owsley has spent years trying to solve the mystery of where the first American came from. Most of us can guess where an individual comes from by looking at their face. Faces often reflect a person's ethnic heritage. Owsley deduces the same information by studying skulls. To his trained eye, skulls from different parts of the world have clear and varying characteristics. There are only a very small number of ancient American skulls, and they are unique.
Well, one of the things that we find when we're dealing with these ancient skeletons, when we compare them to world populations, we find that they don't really fit perfectly with any group.
The closest match in Owsley's opinion is the Ainu, the indigenous people of Japan and the people of the southern Pacific Rim. This forensic examination of ancient American skulls suggests that there wasn't a first American who came over from Siberia. There were most likely lots of first Americans who came from many different places around the Pacific Rim. Owsley's detective work doesn't stop there. He is also intrigued by what the skull record tells him about the connection between the first Americans and today's native North Americans. When he looks at the American skull record, he is struck by not what he sees, but what is missing. This is an ancient American skull, and it's defined by its long, narrow cranium and short face. In contrast, this modern Native American skull has a short, broad cranium and narrow face. Owsley finds no relationship between the two. More surprisingly, he doesn't find a midway evolution point to show how ancient Americans changed gradually over time into Native Americans. For Owsley, this missing link is a mystery.
I don't see a gradual transition where you have this one morphology, these very large heads that tend to be long and narrow and short-faced. I don't see a gradual transition where all of a sudden it becomes a heavier face and it becomes a shorter cranium.
What happened to these South Pacific-looking early Americans? Every single skeleton is valuable because it might give Owsley the answer to this question. In 2006, he gets the chance to study one of the most controversial skeletons of recent times. Owsley's analysis of his bones provides an explanation for the missing link in the skull record. The skeleton's name? Kennewick Man. The story starts in 1996 on the banks of the Columbia River in Washington State. Owsley hears that an ancient skeleton has been found on federal land. But 5 tribes of Native Americans claimed Kennewick Man as their ancestor. They want to give him a respectful burial immediately. A custody battle followed between the U.S. Corps of Engineers and leading scientists. For almost a decade, Kennewick Man remained in limbo. Owsley and his team could only wait and hope.
There's so much that we don't know about this time period, and it's not just a question of where they came from, it's about what life was like during that time period. And if we're not allowed to study the first-hand evidence, if things are found and they're immediately reburied without access, without any opportunity to learn from them, we'll never have answers to those questions.
After 9 years, Owsley wins the fight. The courts at last grant him the right to study the skeleton. Little did he know, this skeleton would help explain the mystery of why early Americans don't appear to resemble today's Native Americans. Owsley takes repeated CAT scans of Kennewick Man's bones. Then, using a technology called stereolithography, he builds up these images layer by layer to recreate a 3D computer reconstruction of each bone. Owsley then uses this 3D CAD file as a blueprint to convert a digital image into a physical part. When the team recreates a prototype of Kennewick Man's hip bone, Owsley identifies something embedded inside it.
When we look at Kennewick Man, he's got this clearly and thrown at him spear and thrown with a lot of force.
The seasoned forensic investigator has seen this kind of injury before. Many early Americans show signs of suffering violent deaths. This suggests to him that they inhabited a world that was less Garden of Eden and more Wild West. If ancient people had the technological sophistication to travel here by boat, it is possible that there could have been people from many different parts of the world fighting to stake their claim on this new continent.
In the one sense, you'd think 10,000 years ago there wouldn't be many people, but apparently there are enough different groups that there's group conflict. That's very surprising to me.
Intergroup warfare is one explanation why there's no link between ancient American skulls and modern Native American ones. Perhaps Owsley finds no transition between these skulls because none exists. These two skulls may not even be related. This is one theory, but there are others.
Did these people disappear? Were they genetically swamped? Were there other people that came in such numbers that they displaced them?
The experts need more clues before they can give a definitive answer. Owsley is sure of one thing. The old story of the first American needs rewriting.
It sounded good, and there's generations that grew up on that story, but it's much more complicated than that.
Finally, more pieces of the puzzle come together. The picture of the very first American is radically different from the one we grew up with. The first Americans were knowledgeable and skillful pioneers, not simply primitive hunters.
If they had no clothing, they had no boats, they had no nets, they had no fishing gear, they would have never made it. There would have been no colonization of the Northern Hemisphere, let alone of the New World.
They reached the Americas thousands of years earlier than we thought, and they may have come by boat. There wasn't a single first American. There were many first Americans, and they likely came from many different places, from all around the Pacific Rim and even from Europe.
Eventually they all get together and we have the fabulous mixing bowl of America that's always been the mixing bowl of America for 20,000 years, apparently. It's neat.
This new picture of the first Americans suggests they came from many different countries. And the melting pot that existed thousands of years ago